Still struggling with the shock, I was crushed by the enormous debt she left behind. My boyfriend abandoned me as well. I spent a brutal decade repaying that debt, only to discover that none of them had died. They were living lavishly in Europe, funded by my sister's debt, while I suffocated under the burden, starving and freezing, surviving like a rat in the gutter. It was pure hell. Remembering it now makes me clench my teeth in fury. Last time my sister faked her death. This time I'll make sure it's real. I rushed forward, gripping my sister's cold body. Sherry, why? How could you be so foolish and throw everything away? I sobbed hysterically, holding her lifeless form, while my parents stood to the side dabbing at non-existent tears. Their pitiful acting was transparent, but I had been too heartbroken to see it before. Fine. If they wanted to treat me like a fool, I would play along. I shook Sherry's body, wailing and cursing her lack of conscience for wanting to die over a man. My parents froze, then rushed to pull me away. What are you doing? My mother glared, her face flushed with anger. Your sister is dead, and you're still hitting her? How can you be so cruel? Feigning remorse, I murmured, I'm sorry, Mum. I got too emotional and lost control. Seeing my genuine tears, my parents relaxed, believing I'd fallen for their act. That's when I noticed Sherry's bandaged hand poking out from under the sheet. I smirked. Last time, I was too devastated to catch these obvious errors. Now I saw their sloppy performance clearly. Since when did a corpse's hand flush with blood? I lunged forward and pressed on Sherry's wrist. She flinched, a low hiss escaping before she suppressed it. I fought back laughter, imagining her face twisting in pain under the sheet. She might have cut herself deeply for authenticity, but the details were wrong, and her supporting cast was far from convincing. What kind of parents remained so calm after losing a child? Judging by the blood on her bandages, Sherry had indeed cut herself. But it wasn't fatal. My parents' faces paled at the sound of her gasp. They rushed to pull me back before I exposed more. Stop. You'll only make your sister suffer more, my mother said. Her face contorted in fake grief. I stared at her incredulously. Mom, are you so upset you've forgotten that the dead don't feel pain? Even though I'm just adopted, I've always treated Sherry like a real sister. Can I give her one last hug before she's gone for good? Mom, Dad, why don't you come and hold her too? Soon she'll be gone forever, and you'll regret missing this chance. Tears and snot streamed down my face as I sobbed dramatically, my performance more convincing than theirs. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. Unnerved by my display, I clutched Sherry tighter, wailing louder as I pressed harder on her wrist. The white sheet gradually stained red. Her hand twitched, but she stubbornly endured the pain. I was almost impressed by her determination. The funeral home staff arrived and prepared to take Sherry away. My parents blocked their path. What do you think you're doing? My father shouted, slapping me. Sherry just died, and you're already rushing to cremate her. Holding my stinging cheek, I sniffled. Dad, I'm just trying to be kind. I thought it'd be better to let her rest in peace quickly. Sherry always said she wanted to be cremated. She hated the idea of being buried and ruining her looks. She wanted to be ashes, free as the waves. Hearing my tearful lies, my parents stared at each other, speechless. My mother threw herself in front of the staff, causing a scene and refusing to let them take Sherry away. The workers, frustrated, turned to me. Who's in charge here? Decide quickly. We're on a tight schedule. My father reluctantly handed them cash to smooth things over. Meanwhile, my mother stepped outside, calling George. "Hurry and get here to take that girl away," she screamed. "Things are moving too fast. Our daughter almost ended up cremated. If anything happens to her, how will we survive?" By the time George arrived, the payment was sorted, and my parents were preparing to take Sherry home. George offered to drive me, claiming Dad's car was too full. I refused. I was determined to keep watch over Sherry, never letting her out of my sight in case they tried another trick. In my past life, they drugged me and swapped bodies, leading to my tragic fate. Remembering how I mourned an empty coffin while they lived in luxury filled me with rage. This time, I'd guard that coffin with my life. If they wanted a performance, I'd give them one they wouldn't forget. I glared at George, brimming with outrage. "George, these are my family. How can you be so cold-hearted? Even if we're not married yet, they're still my parents. And your future in-laws. How can you just abandon them to carry their daughter's body alone? What if they hurt themselves or something goes wrong? How am I supposed to live with that?" My parents tried to interject, but I dismissed them with a wave. "Let's not delay any longer. If we wait, the body will start to decompose. Sherry always took pride in her appearance, even in death. I want her to look her best." As I spoke, I noticed Sherry's body twitch, slightly under the sheet. "Scared already? This is just the beginning, dear sister." Unable to argue, George reluctantly brought a wheelchair and assisted in moving Sherry to the underground garage. As we made our way through the parking area, people shot George strange looks. Some muttered in disgust, shifting their cars to other levels. When we got to his car, George tried to place Sherry in the back seat, but I immediately stopped him. "George, are you serious? You can't just put a corpse in the back seat. What if we terrify some poor passerby on the way?" George hesitated, glancing between Sherry's still body and my parents. I knew exactly what they were worried about, that the cramped trunk would suffocate her. But I did this intentionally to see how they'd handle it. My suggestion was innocent enough to avoid suspicion. After all, it was just a corpse. Nothing unusual. If George refused, it would only look more suspicious. "Stop hesitating," I said, shaking my head in fake disappointment. "It's scorching out here. Do you want my sister to decay in this heat? If you won't do it, I will." Seeing his indecision, I moved toward the trunk. George quickly stepped in, opened it, and shoved Sherry's body inside before slamming it shut. He gave me a weak smile. "I couldn't let you deal with such heavy lifting." As the car started, I noticed a thin red bracelet on George's wrist, the same one I'd seen on Sherry's injured hand. How ironic. He had refused to wear the matching watches I had bought, calling them childish. Yet here he was wearing Sherry's cheap trinket. The signs had been there all along. But if he didn't love me, why not end it? Why humiliate me like this? Their sloppy act was full of flaws, and I'd been too blind to see it. I forced a faint smile. "That bracelet looks familiar." George stiffened, instinctively pulling his hand back. A sweat beaded on his forehead. Just as he began to mumble an excuse, I shrugged. "Never mind. I guess it just looks nice." George visibly relaxed. "According to our local customs, a body must stay at home overnight for burial rites and blessings the next day by a shaman. I was certain they'd try to drug me and swap the bodies while I slept." As I headed upstairs, I heard George and my parents whispering about ways to knock me out. Pretending not to notice, I grabbed a hammer and nails and went back down, beginning to seal the coffin. The sound of hammering brought them running in panic. "What are you doing?" my mother yelled, her face flushed and eyes wild. "Are you trying to kill your sister?" I paused mid-swing, looking at her in confusion. "Mom, Sherry's already gone. Are you so heartbroken you've lost touch with reality?" Sniffling, I resumed hammering. "We should bury Sherry soon. Maybe then you won't feel as sad." Seeing my mother's bewilderment, George intervened, his frustration barely concealed. "Your mother's just upset, talking nonsense. Don't mind her." I nodded, as though understanding, and kept hammering. My mother looked ready to faint, only saved by my father's quick reaction. George rubbed his forehead in exasperation, stepped forward, and gently took the hammer. "Let me do this. Your delicate hands shouldn't handle such heavy work. The shaman can seal it tomorrow." My father quickly agreed, adding, Yes. Leave it to us. It's bad luck for you to do such hard tasks." "No way!" I snapped, grabbing the hammer and nails back. "If the coffin isn't sealed, air will get in and speed up decay. My sister cared about her looks. It's my duty to ensure she leaves looking her best." I continued hammering without another glance at them. My father was so furious he nearly collapsed, and chaos broke out. In the confusion, George wrestled the tools from me and pushed me out of the room. "Your parents are overwhelmed. Let me help them to their room to rest," he said, visibly relieved to be back in control. Later, after I prepared dinner, my parents finally came too. They rushed back to the coffin room, visibly anxious. When they saw the coffin unsealed, they relaxed. They turned and almost jumped when they noticed me standing there. I smiled sweetly. "Mum, Dad, let's eat." "Don't worry." I spoke with George, and he convinced me that leaving the coffin ventilated is better for preserving the body. I was being silly before. "I won't seal it again. Let's have a good meal and rest. Tomorrow will be busy." Reassured by my promise, they reluctantly agreed. My parents finally let out a sigh of relief, casting resentful glances my way before leaving the room. At the dinner table, I served them carefully. "Mum, Dad, please eat. I spent a long time preparing this." My mother eyed the food with contempt. "You sure have an appetite. Your sister just died, and you're making a feast." My father simply glared silently. After dinner, George handed me a glass of water. The moment mirrored what happened in my previous life, and my defenses immediately went up. The last time George gave me a glass, I drank it and blacked out. When I woke the next day, the funeral was halfway over. I arrived just in time to watch Sherry being lowered into her grave. Everyone scolded me for being late, calling me disrespectful. Overwhelmed by guilt and grief, I wept at Sherry's coffin. What a fool I had been. Thankfully, I got another chance. This time, I intended to handle things with Sherry at the hospital, but my parents interfered, putting us on the same path as before. Not this time. I would break free from their twisted plan. As I looked at the glass with tiny white bubbles on the surface, I almost laughed. George's innocent expression only made it funnier. What a bunch of clueless amateurs. Last time, I was so grief-stricken that I missed these obvious signs. Smiling, I took the glass and swallowed it in one go. George's eyes brightened at the sight of the empty glass, his victorious smirk unmistakable. But before I could collapse, he went down first. Calmly, I walked to the sink and spat out the water. Oh, please. Did you really think you could outsmart me with that level of intelligence? I thought. What was I even doing falling for this fool before? I dragged everyone onto the bed, then grabbed the hammer and nails to finish sealing the coffin. Faint sounds of trembling came from within, but I ignored them and continued hammering. When I was nearly done, Sherry couldn't stay silent any longer. She whispered, asking if I was George. With no answer, she began to pound on the coffin, desperate to escape. But, with the heavy lid nailed shut, there was no way she could move it. Once the last nail was in place, I stepped back, a satisfied smile spreading across my face. Sherry's panic grew as she pounded harder, screaming for help. "Scream all you want, dear sister. No one's coming to save you." Her voice turned furious, trembling with fear. "You wretch! Let me out, or I'll wake Mom and Dad. You'll regret this." I laughed at her threat. If they were awake, don't you think they'd have come running at the sound of my hammering? I taunted. "What do you mean?" she faltered, her arrogance slipping away, replaced by fear. Her voice shook. "You thought you could fake your death and leave me with your debts. Clever scheme. But since you want to play dead, I'll make it real. Good luck, dear sister." Sherry's voice quivered. "When did you figure it out?" I smiled silently at the dark coffin. She kept beating on the wood, but her muffled cries reached no one but me. The neighbors knew there'd been a death in the house, so they wouldn't think the sounds were unusual. Plus, they believed homes with the dead were cursed. Even if someone heard, no one would dare come near. Save your strength, dear sister. You don't have much time left. After about 15 minutes, her pounding weakened until it finally stopped. Satisfied, I left the hammer behind and walked away. I had finally avenged the life they robbed me of in my past life. I slept peacefully that night. When I woke, it was time to prepare for the funeral. Her first death was a lie, but this time it was real. As her sister, it was only fitting to give her a grand farewell. Early in the morning, relatives arrived. Great aunts, uncles, and distant cousins, all bustling to help. The shaman had already started chanting by the coffin. I applied subtle morning makeup before stepping out, aiming for the perfect display of filial piety. In our town, the louder you cried, the more devoted you appeared. How could I pass up such a perfect chance to perform? To prepare, I took 3 lozenges the night before to keep my voice clear and strong. When my grandaunt entered the house and saw my parents and George still sleeping soundly, snoring away, she couldn't hide her disgust. "How heartless," she whispered to the others. "Their daughter is gone, and they're sleeping like they don't care. It's shameful." The others shook their heads, clucking their tongues in disapproval. The 3 of them slept through everything, even as Sherry's body was moved for the procession. I suppose I gave them a generous dose. I pretended to wake them several times, but they wouldn't stir. Even the great aunts and other relatives tried, but the trio just snored louder, as if nothing was wrong. To cover my tracks, I explained that they had been up all night playing cards and were exhausted. More muttering and disapproving headshakes filled the room as everyone criticized their lack of heart. When the auspicious hour arrived, the head shaman announced, "We can't wait any longer. It's time to take the deceased to her final resting place to ensure her peace." As they carried the coffin, I walked behind, weeping loudly, tears and snot streaming down my face. From behind, I heard my grandaunt whispering to others, "Look at that! The adopted daughter shows more respect than her own parents." When we arrived at the burial site, my parents finally appeared, stumbling forward in haste. The sight of the sealed coffin hit them like a physical blow, and they fell to their knees. George, stunned by how much the situation had spiraled out of control, staggered over and stammered, Is she really sealed inside? She's not going to, come back, right?" I shot him a contemptuous glare. "What do you think? Show some respect for the dead, or Sherry's spirit might visit you tonight." George's face turned pale. "My daughter, my precious daughter," my mother sobbed, rushing to the coffin. When she realized it was nailed shut, she almost fainted, slumping against it while wailing and sniffling. My father joined her, clutching the coffin and weeping loudly. The crowd watched in confusion, while my grandaunt muttered, "They didn't even attend the mourning ceremony, but now they're making this scene? How ridiculous. I've never seen parents sleep through their own child's funeral." With the added weight of my parents clinging to the coffin, it grew noticeably heavier. The head shaman frowned and sternly warned, "Family members, please avoid getting the coffin wet with tears. The pallbearers can't support your weight." Just as he finished speaking, the coffin fell to the ground with a loud crash. The head shaman gasped in horror. "The coffin falling? In all my years, I've never seen such disrespect." My father's face contorted in rage. He sprang up and punched the shaman squarely in the face. "Who are you to speak that way about my daughter?" he shouted, hitting the shaman repeatedly. "My daughter isn't dead. You're the curse. You and your family." With each yell, his fists struck the shaman's face until the other assistants rushed in to restrain him. The shamans muttered curses under their breath, then came to me for payment before storming off, leaving us to handle things ourselves. Like madmen, my parents began clawing at the nails sealing the coffin, their fingers bleeding, yet they refused to stop. Finally, George fetched some tools and pried the lid open. Sherry's pale, decaying face was exposed for everyone to see. The grand aunts and other onlookers began whispering. My parents clung to her decomposing body, sobbing uncontrollably. "No, my daughter. I refuse to believe she's gone," my mother wailed. Then she spun around and slapped me hard, again and again. "It was you. You're the monster who killed my daughter," she screamed. "I'll call the police and make sure you rot in jail." Just as she was about to hit me again, my fourth aunt, seething with righteous anger, stormed over and slapped her hard. "Enough!" she snapped. "That younger daughter of yours has been dead for ages. You slept through her funeral, and now you're beating the one who took care of everything? Is this how a mother acts? Even if Yanyan is adopted, can't you see how well she's treated you both? Show some fairness." Ignoring my aunt's scolding, my mother continued weeping over Sherry's corpse. Not long after, the police arrived and surrounded us. "We received a report of intentional harm," one officer stated. "Please come with us for questioning." My father stood frozen, staring at Sherry's pale body, tears streaming down his face. My mother, however, pointed at me, screaming, "Officer, arrest this murderer." My daughter isn't dead. She killed her. Everyone, including the police and our relatives, stood stunned, unable to process her accusation. Even George looked panicked, giving her pleading looks to stop, but she was too consumed by grief and vengeance to notice. After the funeral arrangements concluded, we were taken to the police station. My mother accused me of murder, claiming I had trapped Sherry in the coffin to suffocate her. Fighting to defend myself, I turned to the officer, shaking my head, my voice trembling with hurt and disbelief. "No, I didn't. Mom, you're mistaken. After my sister took her own life by slitting her wrists, I just sealed the coffin for the burial. You yourself said she was gone. You wanted to bring her home for the funeral. And now you're accusing me of killing her." "You liar," my mother screamed, pointing at me with pure hatred. "You knew she wasn't dead. We raised you, and this is how you repay us, by murdering our daughter. You heartless creature. I'll make sure you follow her to the grave." Listening to our exchange, the officer pinched the bridge of his nose, visibly exhausted. "Calm down," he ordered. "You're saying your sister was already dead when you sealed the coffin. Do you have proof?" Seeing the doubt in his eyes, I knew he suspected I had buried Sherry alive, but I was ready. I handed him the hospital's official death certificate, speaking solemnly. A death is a serious matter. This certificate was issued when I settled her medical bills. I wanted to cremate my sister to preserve her looks, but my parents insisted on a traditional burial. Where we come from, sealing the coffin keeps insects out. I did it for my sister. How did this turn into a murder accusation? Tears streamed down my face, so convincing that even the officers seemed moved. "My sister is dead, yet you still insist she isn't. Are you suggesting the doctors made a mistake?" My parents hadn't expected me to be this prepared. Their faces turned white with fury, yet they continued accusing me of murder. With no other choice, the officer called in Sherry's attending doctor. When Terry arrived and locked eyes with George. The unease on their faces was unmistakable. I glanced at Terry and smirked. It made sense now why the doctor had agreed to George's plan. George had connections at the hospital. And from what I knew, Terry was one of George's closest friends and a top contender for the hospital's next chief administrator. With Terry's position, pulling a few strings wouldn't have been hard. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Terry broke into a cold sweat under the officer's gaze. Still, he stuck to his story, insisting that Sherry was truly dead. I chuckled and warned him, "Doctor, Terry, remember that falsifying documents is illegal." He shot me a nervous glance, but didn't waver. Turning to my parents, I said firmly, "See, Mom, Dad? Sherry has been dead all along. You're just so overcome with grief that you're saying things you don't mean." I tried to sound sympathetic. Seeing that he couldn't get to me, my father lunged forward to strike me, but the officer stopped him. "Stay calm," the officer commanded. "You're already facing assault charges. Do you want more trouble?" My father glared at both the officer and me, but didn't speak, though his fury was obvious. My mother, however, refused to back down. You're lying," she screamed. "My daughter isn't dead. It's that wretched girl who nailed the coffin shut and killed her." Ice filled with rage, my mother recounted the story to the police, giving every detail. The officer's expression grew more serious as he listened. George, who had started to calm down, grew anxious again, trying to interrupt, but stopping when a deputy gave him a sharp look. "So," the officer said slowly, piecing the story together, "you're saying you set up this whole scenario to make Sophia repay your younger daughter's debt? And that Sophia, not knowing the truth, accidentally sealed your daughter in the coffin, causing her death?" The officer's jaw dropped in disbelief at the twisted scheme. Such manipulative parents were almost beyond comprehension. When he learned that I was only Robert and John's adopted daughter, his shock turned to understanding. My mother, undeterred, continued to insist that I did it intentionally, drugging their food and playing along with their scheme. Her accusations were accurate, but without proof, they couldn't do anything to me. When the police searched the house for evidence, they found nothing. I had already cleaned up any incriminating traces. With tears streaking my face, I looked at my mother and cried. "I never thought you'd treat me this way." "Stop pretending," she snapped, her eyes blazing with fury. "You killed my daughter. You must have known everything." Feigning innocence, I said, "Mom, you need proof to make such claims. How could I have known you planned to fake Sherry's death to make me repay her debts? How could I have killed her for revenge when I didn't know your plan? It's not like I have a crystal ball. Maybe you should blame yourselves for coming up with such a cruel scheme." I turned to George, who had been silent. "Am I right, dear boyfriend?" The moment attention shifted to George, he visibly panicked. There was no escaping now. My mother's fury erupted, and she stormed over, slapping George repeatedly. "This is your fault. You planned all of this. My daughter loved you and trusted you," she screamed. "You probably wanted her dead to take everything for yourself. No wonder you rushed her into signing everything over." George glanced at me, pleading silently, before stammering that he and Sherry were innocent, and that my grief-stricken mother was just lashing out. I feigned disbelief, playing my role perfectly. In the end, my mother's rage consumed her, and she handed over the evidence that implicated herself, George, and their accomplice. Still defiant, George insisted it was all Sherry's idea, claiming he shouldn't suffer for her mistakes. He sneered that Sherry was shameless, seducing him and devising the plan to protect her reputation. He declared she deserved her fate. As the three of them descended into a shouting match, the officers quickly separated them and took them to their cells. In the end, all three were sentenced to 3 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. My father, Robert, received an extra fine of $60,000 for assault. Once everything was settled, a female officer patted my shoulder, giving me a look of sympathy. Later, I paid off the loan sharks with Sherry's debt, even covering the remaining few thousand myself. When it was all done, I visited my adoptive parents in prison. After only a few days behind bars, my mother was a shell of her former self, muttering Sherry's name over and over. When she saw me, she became frantic, trying to break out of her cell to reach me. I stood there, watching their deranged faces with unsettling calm. In my past life, they had pushed me to the brink of madness and death. This time, it was their turn. Looking directly at my mother, I softly described how I nailed Sherry into the coffin, and how she struggled before the end. Hearing this, my mother lost what little sanity she had left, screaming and flailing in her cell, shouting for the guards to arrest me. When an officer arrived, my mother dropped to her knees, begging him to imprison me. Her hand trembled as she pointed at me, her face wild with desperation. "Officer, please arrest her. She confessed. She killed my daughter. Check the cameras. She did it." I laughed. I had deliberately blocked the cameras with my body and spoken too softly for them to catch my words. No officer would waste time investigating the ravings of a madwoman. As expected, the guards simply watched her tantrum in silence before administering a sedative. My mother passed out, her eyes still fixed on me, refusing to close. I approached the corner where my father sat, huddled and silent, his former arrogance completely gone. Seeing him like this filled me with relief. I felt no regret or pity, just a profound sense of fulfillment. All I had done was rewrite the conclusion. avenging the pain they caused me in my past life. They may have brought me into this world, but I had repaid that debt long ago. In this life, they were on their own. As I walked out of the prison, a warm beam of sunlight touched my face, casting a gentle glow on the path ahead. I left behind the city, filled with nothing but bitter memories, and relocated to Paris to begin anew. 2 years later, I met the love of my life, and we got married. Together, we raised our children, worked diligently, and created a home filled with joy and laughter. This was the life I had always wished for, a family where meals were shared, seasons passed peacefully, and simplicity brought happiness. At last, I had found my new beginning. Thank you for watching. If you liked this story, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next video.